There's a moment that happens in every person's life, though most never notice it. A moment where reality doesn't bend, break, or suddenly transform in some dramatic spiritual explosion, but instead shifts so subtly that it feels like nothing happened at all. Yet the days that follow feel different, the opportunities feel different, the way people respond to you feels different. And if you look closely, you can feel that you are the thing that's different. That moment is not luck, fate, destiny, or coincidence. It's the instant your observer state changed and your entire timeline rearranged itself around that new vantage point. Most people assume timelines shift when something external changes, when they improve their habits, make a brave decision, or force their life into a new direction. But the truth is far more elusive and far more powerful. Your reality shifts the moment the one who is observing the reality shifts. What collapses and becomes solid in your world isn't determined by your goals, your desires, your affirmations, or your rituals. It's determined by the consciousness that is doing the observing. This is the silent mechanism behind every timeline jump you've ever experienced, and most of them happened without your awareness. So let's strip away the mysticism for a moment. Every version of reality exists as a probability, an unexpressed possibility waiting in the field. Nothing is fixed, nothing is predetermined. Everything is in a suspended state, waiting to be selected by the lens of consciousness. The moment you place your attention on something, you collapse the wave of possibilities into a single outcome. But here's the part people miss. You don't collapse reality with your eyes, you collapse it with your identity. It's not what you look at that chooses a timeline, it's who you are while you're looking. This is why two people can stand in the same circumstance but inhabit completely different timelines. One sees opportunity, the other sees limitation. One sees connection, the other sees threat. One sees potential, the other sees patterns repeating. The external moment is identical, the internal observer is not. And because of that, the reality each person collapses is entirely different. Most people aren't living in the world as it is. They're living in the world as their observer state permits them to see it. When your observer is locked in fear, you collapse the version of reality that fear expects. When your observer is trapped in self-doubt, you collapse the version of reality where doubt is confirmed. When your observer is rooted in possibility, in coherence, in a deeper trust in your inner guidance, the field is allowed to generate outcomes that match that state. This is why wanting a new timeline doesn't create one. You can want a new path with every cell in your body, but if your observer is still tuned to lack, scarcity, fear, or survival, you will only ever collapse the timeline that matches what you believe is possible. And this is where the true awakening begins. Because once you understand that you're not stuck in a timeline, you're stuck in a way of observing, you realize that the fastest way to change reality is to change the vantage point from which you witness it. Every shift you've ever made in your life began with a moment where you saw yourself differently, interpreted something differently, or felt the world from a new internal altitude. That shift was the observer changing. The timeline shift was simply the field responding. Imagine standing in a hallway with hundreds of doors, each representing a different version of your life, different relationships, different levels of abundance, different opportunities, different timelines of healing, growth, purpose, and love. Most people think they have to run around trying to force the right door open, but in truth, you don't open doors, you tune into them. Your observer state determines which door is even visible to you. When your internal frequency shifts, the hallway rearranges, new doors appear, old ones dissolve, potential reorganizes, not because you forced anything externally, but because the internal vantage point that is doing the observing upgraded. This is the real mechanism behind every timeline jump. It's not a strategy, it's not a ritual, it's not a technique, it's an internal shift in consciousness so fundamental that the field cannot continue generating the old version of your life. The observer changes, and the timeline has no choice but to change with it. The real question is not how do I jump timelines, but rather, what kind of observer must I become for that timeline to become visible? Because all timelines already exist. All outcomes already exist. The universe doesn't rearrange itself when you shift. Your access rearranges, your perception rearranges, the possibilities you can collapse rearrange. And when you fully understand this, you stop fighting the world and start transforming the vantage point from which you see it. This is where timeline shifting stops being mystical and becomes practical. The observer effect isn't just a scientific principle, it's the architecture of your lived experience. Or when you shift the observer, reality must follow. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how that mechanism works, how dimensions layer into it, and how you can consciously shift the observer in a way that allows new timelines to become not just possible, but inevitable. Most people think of dimensions as places, distant realms stacked above one another like floors in a cosmic building. But dimensions are not locations, they're positions of consciousness. They're the altitude from which your observer perceives reality. And once you understand this, you'll begin to see why your life can feel completely different from one week to the next. Even if nothing external has changed, the shift didn't happen outside. It happened in the vantage point of the observer. Here's the micro-revelation most people miss. You don't move between dimensions, you perceive from them. And the moment your perception shifts, the dimension you operate from shifts with it. This is why some days you feel incredibly clear, intuitive, guided and aligned, while other days you feel dense, reactive, emotional and closed. You didn't become a different person. You're observing your life from a different dimensional altitude. Think of 3D, 4D, and 5D not as woo-woo constructs, but as mental, emotional vantage points that determine what your observer can even register as possible. Because if your observer is locked in the dimensional layer of survival, it cannot see the possibilities that exist in the dimensional layer of expansion. It's not that those possibilities don't exist, they're simply not within your perceptual bandwidth. Here's where it gets interesting. You've already experienced all these dimensions without calling them that. When you're anxious, everything looks threatening. When you're hopeful, everything looks possible. When you're deeply present, everything feels connected. Those are dimensional shifts, not emotional fluctuations, dimensional relocations of your observer. Most people live their entire lives in 3D observation without realizing it. In 3D, the observer is reactive. It believes reality is happening to it. It sees life as a series of external events it must respond to. Its awareness is narrow, focused on threats, survival, and control. In 3D, you collapse timelines based on fear, because fear is the dominant lens of perception. And here's the quiet truth. When fear is the observer, even neutral situations collapse into negative outcomes. But something extraordinary happens the moment you step into 4D observation. The reactive lens softens. The observer becomes aware that thoughts shape outcomes, emotions influence possibilities, and attention shifts reality. You begin to realize there is an inner world that precedes the outer one. This dimension isn't airy or esoteric, it's psychological. It's the dimension where you recognize that your perception is sculpting your experience. The moment you witness that, the observer rises. And then there's 5D, the level of coherent observation. This is where you perceive not from survival or self-narrative, but from a state of integration. In 5D, the observer is stable, clear, present, and non-reactive. It sees patterns, connections, synchronicities, and pathways that the lower dimensions cannot reveal. You could be standing in the same room, having the same conversation, but your interpretation from this level is radically different. And because your interpretation changes, the timeline that collapses changes. Here's a subtle but crucial insight. Dimensions don't change your reality, they change your interpretation, and your interpretation changes the reality you collapse. This is why two people in the same situation will experience completely different timelines. If one is observing from 3D, they see limitation. If the other is observing from 5D, they see opportunity. The situation didn't shift, the dimension of the observer did, and the moment the observer shifts dimensions, the field reorganizes to match that altitude. Let's take this deeper. Every emotion you feel is a signal telling you which dimension your observer is currently inhabiting. Fear tells you the observer dropped into 3D. Hope tells you the observer is rising into 4D. Inner knowing tells you the observer is stabilizing in 5D. Your emotional body isn't malfunctioning. It's communicating your dimensional position. When you feel heavy, it's not because something is wrong, it's because your observer is positioned low. And when you feel expansive, it's not because something magical happened, it's because your observer ascended into a dimension where more possibilities exist. Dimensions and timelines are the same phenomenon seen from different angles. A dimension is the lens, a timeline is the outcome of that lens. Change the dimension, and the timeline that collapses cannot remain the same. This is why people often have spontaneous breakthroughs after meditation, breathwork, deep presence, or emotional release. They think they unlocked something mystical. What actually happened is that their observer temporarily shifted into a higher dimension, and the field responded by presenting new pathways, new insights, new conversations, or new opportunities. But here's the part no one talks about: dimensional stability. Most people visit higher dimensions but don't stay there. They have moments of clarity but quickly fall back into old observation patterns. The observer rises, then collapses back into old loops. And this is why their timelines don't permanently shift. Temporary dimensional elevation creates temporary timeline openings, but for the timeline to stabilize, the observer must stabilize. A brief moment of 5D clarity cannot override the gravitational pull of a 3D identity. And this is where the true observer effect begins, when you realize that your life doesn't change because you momentarily feel better. It changes when you become a different vantage point altogether. The dimensional model explains why spiritual awakening feels like a constant oscillation. One day you feel deeply aligned, seeing the deeper meaning in everything. The next day, you feel like you're drowning in old patterns. You're not regressing, you're flickering between dimensional positions. You're learning how to stay at an altitude your nervous system isn't yet conditioned to maintain. And here's the revelation that creates the deepest shift. A higher dimension doesn't remove obstacles. It removes misinterpretation. From 3D, a challenge looks like a threat. From 4D, a challenge looks like feedback. From 5D, a challenge looks like recalibration. And because each dimension interprets meaning differently, each dimension collapses a different timeline in response. The situation doesn't change. What it means changes, and the meaning determines the reality that materializes. Once you learn to hold the observer at a higher dimensional altitude, new timelines stop appearing as breakthroughs or miracles and start appearing as the natural consequence of who you've become. If you want to understand why certain timelines feel impossible to access, you have to start here. Your emotional state is not just a feeling, it's a gravitational field. It pulls certain outcomes towards you and repels others. It anchors you to specific versions of reality in the same way the earth anchors objects to the ground. And once you start seeing emotions as fields instead of moods, you begin to understand why your life doesn't shift simply because you want it to. Desire has no gravitational pull. Emotion does. Here's the revelation. Every timeline has an emotional signature, and your body can only tune in to the timelines that match the frequency it is currently generating. This is why you can imagine a better future, script it, visualize it, affirm it, yet still find yourself living the same patterns. Your mind may try to climb into a new timeline, but if your emotional field is magnetized to the old one, your observer collapses reality through that field, not through your thoughts. Thoughts flicker, emotions anchor, and anchoring is what determines the version of reality you can access. Think about the last time you were overwhelmed. In that state, your world narrowed. Opportunities felt distant, solutions felt hidden. You could barely see beyond the problem in front of you. That wasn't because nothing existed, it was because your emotional field locked your observer into a timeline where only threat-based outcomes were visible. Now think about a moment when you felt clear, grounded, or inspired. Doors opened, ideas appeared, synchronicity amplified. The world felt lighter because your emotional field lifted your observer into a different version of reality. Most people assume emotions reflect what's happening in their life, but the deeper truth is that emotions are generators. They produce the timeline your observer will collapse. Every feeling is a filter, and the emotional filter you're in right now dictates what your consciousness can interact with. Fear collapses a timeline where fear is confirmed. Doubt collapses a timeline where doubt is validated. Resentment collapses a timeline where resentment has evidence. But the same mechanisms work for elevated states. Neutrality collapses a timeline with more choice. Hope collapses a timeline with more possibility. Coherence collapses a timeline where alignment is inevitable. This is why emotional regulation is far more than a mental health tool. It is a timeline shifting tool. When you regulate your nervous system, you are not calming down, you are repositioning your observer into a dimension where more probable futures exist. Emotional stability is dimensional stability, and dimensional stability is what allows a new timeline to hold. You cannot shift timelines from the emotional field of the timeline you're trying to leave. This is the mistake almost everyone makes. They want abundance while emotionally identifying with lack. They want love while carrying the emotional gravity of abandonment. They want transformation while feeling anchored in self-doubt. They don't realize that these emotions aren't just uncomfortable. They are frequency locks. They keep the observer anchored to the very dimension that generates the timeline they want to escape. And this is why willpower fails. Why motivation collapses. Why change feels temporary. You're trying to drag your life into a new direction while your emotional field is pulling you backward. The observer can only collapse the version of reality that matches the emotional signature it inhabits. And until that signature shifts, nothing externally can stabilize. But this is where awakening becomes powerful, because once you know this, you stop trying to change your life from the outside. You start generating the emotional field of the timeline you want before it exists. This is not about pretending or forcing positivity. Those approaches collapse nothing. Emotional gravity can't be faked. What you actually do is shift into an inner state where your observer becomes capable of perceiving outcomes aligned with that state. It's less about producing a feeling and more about creating a stable inner lens. You don't have to be euphoric to shift timelines. You simply have to stop broadcasting the emotional gravity of the dimension you've outgrown. Neutrality, for example, is one of the most underrated timeline tools. People underestimate neutrality because it doesn't feel glamorous, but neutrality is the emotional equivalent of weightlessness. It releases the gravitational pull of old patterns. It's the place where the observer stops collapsing the same outcomes through the same emotional filters. It's where possibilities widen. It's the emotional reset button that frees the observer to rise dimensionally. Hope works differently. Hope expands the perceptual field. It doesn't guarantee outcomes, but it opens pathways the lower dimensions could never reveal. When you feel even a small flicker of hope, the observer shifts into a dimension where previously invisible timelines become conceivable. That's the first collapse into a new trajectory. And coherence. Coherence is where timelines reorganize. It's the emotional field where your nervous system, mind, and intention align. When you enter coherence, even briefly, your observer rises into a dimension where clarity replaces confusion. You can feel the shift in the most subtle ways. The world feels quieter. Insight becomes more accessible. Your next step feels obvious. That's not magic. That's the observer locking into a higher emotional altitude. It's you accessing a timeline where solutions already exist. Now here's the deeper reveal. Your emotional field is not created by your circumstances. It's created by what your observer believes is true. This means emotional gravity is an expression of belief gravity. Fear isn't just a feeling, it's a belief about what's possible. Doubt isn't just discomfort, it's a belief about what you deserve. Confidence isn't just a mindset, it's a belief about your place in the field. And when belief shifts, the emotional field shifts. When the emotional field shifts, the observer shifts. When the observer shifts, the dimension shifts. And when the dimension shifts, the timeline cannot remain the same. The change always begins internally and the field reorganizes in response. This is why emotional self-awareness is one of the most advanced spiritual technologies available. It's not about becoming positive, it's about becoming accurate. It's about noticing when your emotional gravity is collapsing a timeline you've already outgrown. It's about interrupting the automatic gravitational pull of old identity structures. And when you remove emotional gravity from a timeline, it collapses behind you. In the next movement, we'll go deeper into why certain timelines keep repeating, even when you try to shift them, and how to break the loop not by forcing action, but by transforming the observer responsible for generating it. You will eventually realize something unsettling. You're not repeating situations because life is unfair or because the universe is testing you. You're repeating them because your observer hasn't changed. The loop isn't in the world, it's in the vantage point you keep returning to. And this is the part no one tells you to build until the observer identity upgrades, the timeline cannot. Patterns aren't persistent because they're powerful. They're persistent because you keep collapsing reality through the same inner lens. Most people believe they're stuck because of their circumstances. They think the problem is the job, the relationship, the finances, the past, the environment. But the truth is much simpler and far more confronting. You're stuck because you're observing your life from the exact same internal position that created the problem in the first place. And when the internal vantage point doesn't change, the field has no choice but to collapse the familiar timeline again. Not because you're meant to suffer, but because the observer is still tuned to the timeline it already knows how to perceive. Here's the quiet mechanism behind every loop. The observer seeks confirmation of its own identity. If your inner narrative says, "I am overlooked," your observer is tuned to notice subtle evidence of being overlooked. If your internal vantage point says, "Things don't work out for me," the observer collapses the timeline where outcomes are delayed, distorted, or denied. This doesn't happen consciously. It happens automatically through the emotional signatures and perceptual filters the observer uses as its default operating system. Most people think they have free will, but what they actually have is an unexamined observer identity replaying the same timeline because it doesn't yet know how to perceive anything else. And this is where loops become deceptive. They don't always show up as identical experiences. Sometimes the details change, but the emotional architecture stays the same. The relationships are different, but the feeling is familiar. The job is new, but the frustration hasn't changed. The external form evolves just enough to feel different, but the internal timeline remains identical. That's not coincidence. That's the observer returning to the vantage point that feels recognizable, even if it's painful. Familiarity becomes the gravitational pull, and the observer collapses reality through the emotional fields it unconsciously trusts. Here's the subtle revelation that starts to break the loop. The observer doesn't cling to old timelines because they're true. It clings because they're known, and the nervous system prefers the known even if it's limiting. When uncertainty feels unsafe, the observer cannot ascend into a higher dimensional vantage point. It stays low, close to the ground, scanning for anything that confirms its previous experience. This is why growth often feels like you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. You rise into a higher dimension of observation, but your identity reflexively falls back to the vantage point where it feels familiar. The loop isn't a punishment, it's an identity safety mechanism. This is also why action alone rarely breaks the cycle. You can change your habits, your routines, your environment, and even your relationships, but if the observer remains unchanged, it will interpret all those new experiences through the old, emotional lens. And interpretation is what collapses the timeline. 2 people can take the exact same action with completely different results because one is acting from a higher observer state, while the other is acting from the observer identity that created the problem. You don't escape a loop by doing more things. You escape a loop by perceiving from a dimension that no longer matches the loop at all. Now here's where the concept becomes even more precise. Every timeline loop has an emotional anchor. It might be anxiety, self-doubt, unworthiness, control, or fear of abandonment. These emotions aren't random. They are the gravitational signatures of the observer identity that keeps collapsing the timeline. And until those anchors lift, the observer cannot sustain a new altitude long enough for a different timeline to stabilize. This is why temporary breakthroughs feel so exhilarating. You briefly rise above the gravitational field of your old identity. But unless the observer truly shifts, the emotional anchor pulls you back into the old dimensional position. The key is this. A timeline loop dissolves the moment the observer sees itself with new accuracy. Not new positivity, new accuracy. Awakening begins when you see that the loop isn't a reflection of your worth, your intelligence, or your potential. It's a reflection of the vantage point you've been conditioned to observe from. And that vantage point isn't fixed, it's learned. Anything learned can be unlearned. Anything perceived can be reperceived. And once perception shifts, the loop no longer has anything to attach to. Let's take this deeper. You don't break a loop by fighting it. The moment you engage in resistance, you reinforce the emotional field of the timeline you're trying to escape. You break a loop by becoming a version of the observer who cannot recognize the loop as real. When your inner vantage point rises into a dimension where coherence, clarity, or inner authority dominate, the old timeline simply loses access to you. It doesn't get resolved, it dissolves. Loops don't end when the problem disappears. Loops end when the observer becomes incompatible with the version of reality where that problem exists. This is why certain moments in your life seem to change everything, not because the moment was powerful, but because the version of you observing that moment was. You were standing in a higher dimension, and in that elevation, the old timeline broke. You couldn't go back, even if you tried. Your perception shifted. Your emotional field shifted. Your meaning-making shifted. Your gravitational pull shifted. And the timeline that matched your old identity no longer had anything to hold on to. Here's the final ribbon around this concept. timeline loops are not failures. They are mirrors reflecting your current observer identity. They show you exactly where you're still perceiving from, exactly which emotional signatures still magnetize your choices, and exactly which vantage points you haven't yet outgrown. And when you understand this, loops stop feeling like setbacks and start feeling like data. They become indicators of where the observer is ready to rise. And when the observer rises, the field responds. When the vantage point shifts, the dimension shifts. And when the dimension shifts, the loop ends because the timeline it belonged to no longer exists at your new altitude. By the time you reach this point in your awakening, you start to wonder how these internal shifts can be made intentionally. Not by accident, not by breakthrough, not by emotional crisis, but by conscious design. And this is where dimensional shifting becomes less of a mystical concept and more of a practical internal technology, because shifting timelines is not about becoming a different person. It's about observing from a different altitude long enough for the field to reorganize around that vantage point. Everything begins with one deceptively simple realization. You cannot access a higher timeline with the emotional signatures of a lower dimension. You have to rise before the reality does. You must shift the observer before anything collapses differently in your external world. And that shift is not dramatic, it's subtle. It begins with the smallest interruption of an old interpretation. It starts the moment you stop automatically collapsing reality through your familiar emotional filter. That is the origin of every dimensional move. The first mechanic is detachment, but not in the way it's often misunderstood. Detachment isn't the absence of emotion, it's the absence of emotional identification. It's the ability to notice your internal state without collapsing your identity into it. When you detach, you create a psychological altitude between the observer and the reaction. It's that microsecond of awareness that says, this is what I'm feeling, not what I am. And in that separation, the gravitational pull of the old timeline begins to weaken. You free the observer from collapsing the same outcome automatically. Detachment is the moment your inner lens stops filtering reality through the assumptions of the past. From that space, the second mechanic emerges almost naturally. You begin observing from the reality you want instead of looking for evidence of it. This is the shift that most people never make. They wait to see the new timeline before they observe from it, not realizing that the observer must occupy the new vantage point before the field can reflect it. Observing from the desired reality isn't about pretending, it's about sensing the version of yourself who already exists in that timeline, how they interpret moments, how their nervous system feels, how they make meaning, how they choose, how they respond. When you do this sincerely, even for a moment, you tune the observer to a new identity. An identity is the lens through which timelines collapse. This is why visualization often fails and why affirmations don't always work. You can imagine a new outcome or repeat new thoughts, but if the observer hasn't shifted into the self who belongs in that reality, the emotional field contradicts the intention. Your conscious mind says one thing, but your observer is still collapsing the timeline of who you used to be. When you observe from the destination instead of the path, you bypass effort and step directly into the vantage point that aligns with the outcome. It's not about seeing a better future, it's about seeing from it. The third mechanic is stabilization, and this is where timeline shifting becomes real. Anyone can touch a higher dimension for a moment. Inspiration can lift you, meditation can elevate you, synchronicity can open you. But unless the observer stabilizes at that altitude, the gravitational pull of old identity structures will drag you back. Stabilization is the process of holding a new internal vantage point long enough for the field to reorganize around your new emotional and perceptual baseline. It's the difference between a temporary shift and a permanent one. Stabilization doesn't come from forcing yourself into positive states. It comes from choosing interpretations that align with the observer you're becoming. When something challenges you, the old observer collapses the timeline of threat. The new observer collapses the timeline of meaning. When something delays, the old observer collapses the timeline of fear. The new observer collapses the timeline of timing. Stability requires you to hold the dimension even when your external world hasn't yet rearranged. You stay at the altitude and the field eventually matches you. Another critical mechanic is learning to recognize the feeling of a dimensional shift. Most people look for dramatic signs, but dimensional movement is subtle. A quietness in the chest, a widening in the mind, a softened gaze, a sense of spaciousness around your thoughts, a moment of clarity that wasn't available a second ago. These sensations are not random. They're indicators that your nervous system has temporarily aligned with a higher perceptual layer. When you learn to notice these micro shifts, you can anchor them intentionally. You can breathe into them, you can extend them. And each time you extend them, the observer becomes more comfortable staying in that altitude. Then comes the mechanic that very few talk about, future memory. This is the phenomenon where you momentarily feel the reality of a future timeline as if it has already happened. You don't see it, you recognize it. It arrives as a sense, a knowing, a resonance that feels oddly familiar even though your conscious mind has no reference for it. This is not imagination. It's the observer tuning into the version of yourself that already exists in that dimension of consciousness. Future memory acts as a bridge. It shows the observer what it feels like to inhabit the new timeline, and once the observer knows the feeling, it can return to it. This is one of the reasons awakening accelerates in cycles. Once the observer has felt a higher dimension, it cannot unknow that state. Even if you drop back into old patterns, the memory of the higher vantage point remains. And that memory becomes a gravitational pull upward. It becomes the orientation point for stabilization. It becomes the reference for the identity you're growing into. And here's a subtle yet powerful mechanic. Dimensional shifting doesn't require you to fix anything. It requires you to see differently. You don't ascend by solving problems. You ascend by recognizing that the version of you who perceives those problems from a higher dimension is not overwhelmed by them. When the observer rises, the interpretation changes, the meaning changes, and when meaning changes, the timeline that collapses changes. Solutions appear not because the problem vanished, but because the observer's vantage point now reveals possibilities that were previously invisible. The deepest revelation woven through all of this is simple. The field always follows the observer, not quickly, not instantly, not dramatically, but faithfully. Every dimensional shift you hold becomes a subtle instruction to the universe. It tells the field which version of reality you are now capable of perceiving, and the field organizes around that capacity. The external world remodels itself to match the altitude of your internal witness. In this way, shifting timelines becomes far less mysterious and far more intimate. It isn't something you achieve, it's something you inhabit. You rise dimensionally, stabilize the observer, and the timeline that corresponds to that dimension becomes the only one available. By now you've seen that timelines don't shift because life suddenly decides to favor you. They shift because the vantage point from which you observe yourself becomes incompatible with the version of reality you use to collapse. And when you truly understand this, something profound happens. You stop trying to change the external world and start transforming the observer who interprets it. This final shift is where awakening stops being a concept and becomes a lived experience. It's where you begin experiencing reality not as something you chase, but as something that responds to the level of consciousness you occupy. The first revelation in this final movement is deceptively simple. You don't move into new timelines, you tune into them. The timelines aren't somewhere else, they're here, overlapping in the same field, waiting for your observer to align with the one you're ready to inhabit. When you rise into a higher dimension of perception, you don't magically jump into a different universe. You simply begin perceiving a version of reality that was always present but previously inaccessible because your observer wasn't at the altitude required to recognize it. This is why the deepest timeline shifts often feel effortless. Not because nothing changed, but because you changed so fundamentally that the old reality no longer had anywhere to attach itself. It dissolves quietly without drama because the observer that once sustained it no longer exists. That's the real secret. Timelines aren't rewritten through force, they are overwritten through identity. An identity in this context has nothing to do with personality. It has everything to do with the consciousness witnessing the personality. When you stop observing yourself through the lens of fear, lack, or limitation, you begin collapsing timelines where those states are not the governing force. When you begin observing yourself from coherence, clarity, and inner authority, you collapse timelines where those qualities shape the outcomes. This shift is not loud, it's not theatrical, it's not something you announce, it's something you quietly become, and your reality adjusts accordingly. One of the most powerful realizations is that the observer doesn't need to be perfect to create a new timeline. It simply needs to be consistent. Stability is more transformative than intensity. A gentle, repeated return to a higher vantage point has more power than a dramatic spiritual breakthrough, followed by a collapse back into older states. Timelines respond to the identity you inhabit most frequently, not the identity you touch occasionally. This is why your inner work doesn't need to be spectacular. It needs to be stable. A steady observer creates a steady shift. And here's a truth that liberates thousands of people when they finally hear it. You are not trying to become a higher version of yourself. You are learning to observe from the dimension where that version already exists. But your future self isn't waiting to be built. They're waiting to be recognized. The moment you sense their perspective, their emotional neutrality, their clarity, their internal coherence, you tune into the dimension where their timeline unfolds naturally. You begin to see through their eyes, and as you do, your field reorganizes around their reality. This is why the ending of a profound inner cycle often feels like a quiet knowing rather than a triumphant celebration. You simply wake up one day and realize you are not available for the old timeline anymore. You can feel that your nervous system no longer interprets life from the vantage point that created the previous loop. You are subtly, undeniably observing from a new consciousness. And with that shift, the past timeline loses its gravitational pull. The field no longer presents it because the observer is no longer collapsing it. In this way, the observer effect becomes the most empowering spiritual truth you can integrate. It places the locus of transformation inside you, not in your circumstances, not in rituals, not in signs, not in external validation. Well, when the observer changes, reality reorganizes. When the observer stabilizes, timelines stabilize. When the observer rises dimensionally, life begins to reflect that rise with remarkable fidelity. And this is the revelation I want to leave you with. The universe is not testing you, withholding from you, or waiting for you to earn the next level of your life. It is mirroring the dimension of the observer you're currently inhabiting. The moment you shift the vantage point from which you witness yourself, you shift the dimension from which you create. And when the dimension shifts, the timeline that corresponds to that dimension becomes the only one that can materialize. You don't have to force what's next. You only have to become the observer who can perceive it. Once you rise into that state, quietly, sincerely, consistently, the field has no choice but to reveal the reality that matches your new altitude.